Hello and welcome to this video on making an apple tree bonsai. Many apple tree bonsai are actually crabapple bonsai. While a related species, they are different from your typical apple that is eaten fresh. This means they require slightly different handling. For that reason, this video will go over the steps and requirements of creating a standard apple bonsai, rather than a crabapple bonsai. Whether you want to grow a green, red or yellowish table apple, any of these will require the same basic concepts and steps. For that reason, we are not going to differentiate, and you can apply any of this to any of those examples. First, let's assume that you have a fairly limited tree to start with. This could be a whip from a nursery, a beginner seedling, or something similar. This is, to start, much harder than other ways. It is just as viable, but you'll need to work on it for far longer before seeing most of the results that you are after. First of all, we have positioning. Much like most bonsai species, the apple will prefer to be kept in a sunny location. Given the nature of bonsai, semi-shaded is probably preferable depending on your location, but the further north or south you are, the more direct sunlight you want. In winter, you want to protect the bonsai roots as much as possible. This can be done by burying it in a layer of mulch or similar. This will protect the tree from some of the more extreme changes in temperature. The roots are especially vulnerable to this. For the most part, you want to avoid bringing them indoors if you can. And this is owing to the fact that a fruiting bonsai do need a prolonged period of dormancy to be able to not only flower but fruit the next year. As a result, after the first few years, you actually want to leave them outdoors, albeit in a protected location, for most of winter. Being a fruiting bonsai, water is going to be especially important, more so once the tree actually starts to develop fruit, as if you have inconsistent watering, or if you are careless, you will lose the fruit entirely. And if you are lucky, let's say, the fruit will look terrible. If you're after eating fruit rather than exhibiting the tree, this won't really matter, but if you want to exhibit it, you want to keep it in the best possible appearance. As a general rule, keep the soil moist, not wet. This can be done quite simply by putting your finger and pushing slightly on the soil surface. If the grains of soil stick to your finger, it's wet enough. Once the tree starts to bear fruit, you do want to increase the frequency of watering just a little bit, or increase the amount of water you use, but frequency is the better option. This will ensure the fruit maintains a plump appearance. Fertilizing for a apple tree is honestly a little more difficult. You want to ensure a balanced fertilizer for most of the time in which you're growing it. You should be feeding it regularly, and ideally, you want to ensure that you use fertilizer that is, let's say, generic most of the time, except in early spring. From a late winter through to, say, mid-spring, you want to use a lower nitrogen fertilizer. The reason you want to do this is that nitrogen will encourage leaf growth, but it will come at the demerit of flower growth. Without flowers, there is no fruit. Using a lower nitrogen fertilizer will generally ensure a higher level of potassium and phosphorus. This will improve the development of roots, and it will also improve the development of flowers. Then we have the pruning issue. You want to prune for several outcomes with an apple tree bonsai. First of all is airflow. Airflow will prevent issues around mold and similar. The other effect of this will be that you improve the penetration of light through the canopy and into the inner depths of the tree. This will help to get not only leaves developing further in, but also branches. This will further support ramification. By pruning this way, you also get a better effect on styling, because you have to at least somewhat maintain the pruning regularly. If you don't, you'll find that the developments become so thick in terms of ramification that it's actually quite difficult to do anything with it. For the most part, target your pruning of large branches at the end of winter, just before spring starts, so that the growth will cover up any wounds you've created, and for smaller pruning, throughout spring, again for much the same reason, but also to counteract the extreme growth of the fertilizer you'll be feeding it. In terms of summer through to autumn, you can prune less aggressively, and you may need to in order to remove some of the excess apples, but try not to take away a large growth or prune aggressively at this time. The tree will not respond as well and often start growing more aggressively to compensate for what you're doing to it. This can be, let's say, more difficult depending on the style you're going for. You want to ideally mimic something at least vaguely similar to what the apple tree would do in nature. This means things like a cascade aren't going to work as well. It's not to say that you can't do that, it's simply going to be more work and the growth will be more difficult. Because of that, something like an informal upright or formal upright work quite well. Creating a cascade will require a degree of, let's say, creative thinking to make it work. If you want to be more artistic, a windswept and even root over rock in some cases can work quite well. In terms of the growth, we've already mentioned it, but the apple tree will grow relatively fast, in fact arguably very fast. And this is one of the reasons why you want to prune quite aggressively, especially at the start of spring, to maximize the movement of that growth rather than into undesired branches, into the branches you want to get things like ramification for. In the first few years, you'll see between, say, 30 centimeters and up to nearly a meter in growth in the first few years. After about 5 years, this will drop down to somewhere between 20 and 30 centimeters, although this will vary somewhat between cultivars and varieties. This is also owing to the nature of what you're doing to the tree as well. The growth may not be apparent if you prune regularly. Depending on what you want to achieve and how large a bonsai you want, you may also wish to prune accordingly. A bigger tree, you'll prune less regularly, but focus on certain branches to encourage growth there. Conversely, a smaller tree, you'll prune more aggressively all around. We've mentioned the need for fertilizer, and as said, fertilize aggressively with a all-purpose fertilizer at the end of winter. Into spring, use a low nitrogen but high phosphor and potassium fertilizer, and then change back to an all-purpose every other week in the midst of summer going through to the start of autumn. Once you get into autumn, start using a low nitrogen, higher phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, but decreasingly use the fertilizer. Either choose a lower concentration or less frequently. One concern you have, especially in the start of spring and in autumn, is wiring your apple tree bonsai. Wiring can be quite difficult when it grows so quickly and so aggressively. You need to be very much aware of this as a consideration. It doesn't matter so much which wire you're using, but be aware that either aluminium or copper wire can cut into the branches just as easily. When you are applying your wire, look at doing so either at the very start of spring or possibly at the end of winter, depending on how the environmental conditions are going. Warmer weather, you might prefer to do so at the end of winter, particularly if you are in a more temperate environment. The wire should be applied before the sap starts to really flow within the branches. The reason for this is that once the sap starts to flow, you will find the branches are more likely to become at least somewhat brittle and snap. The other reason is very simply that, well, end of winter, start of spring, the leaves have dropped off the tree and you can actually see what you're doing with relative ease. The small, let's say, fine work, particularly talking about foliage pads, should be done in summer, and this is because those very small branches are actually a little bit easier to work when the sap flows. As a result, very tiny work is done in summer, but anything involving larger branches or even really branches of any kind of consideration should be done at the end of winter into early spring. For most apple tree bonsai, you can look at removing the wire towards the end of summer. You may need to leave it on into autumn when the branches begin to set, but for the most part in summer you can remove it as the tree will have established itself in the style you want. In terms of places where you can grow these, apple trees are fairly resilient no matter where you're growing them, assuming that we're not talking about some extremes in weather such as the extreme northern latitudes or the middle of a desert. Assuming that your apple tree bonsai is kept in ideal conditions, fertilized regularly and so on, it will grow very big and very quickly. Generally speaking, if you were to grow the same tree in the ground, it would grow very tall. This again brings us back to the idea of redirecting that growth. You don't want it to grow necessarily upwards. Rather than tall, you want it to be wide in many cases. And in some instances, you might be better off working on an abari before you start trying to develop the tree into something particularly stylized. We have several methods on how to do this. For example, growing the tree in a relatively shallow container, but one that is wide, will force the trunk to spread out and get a widened abari. Other choices are things like sacrifice branches. Training pots or growing pots are another way to do this again. Once you shift it into a bonsai pot, however, that growth will very quickly taper off, and you'll find that it grows significantly more slowly than a comparative example grown in the ground. And now for the, let's say, disappointing news for many people. That is, how long it will take to get fruit on your bonsai. The reality is that if you're going to grow it from seed, for example an apple you bought at the market or similar, you would have to wait about 10 years. Yeah, it's a long time. If you buy a sapling, whip or similar from a nursery, it's likely to be a few years old and you would likely get fruit within 8 or fewer years. If you have a bonsai of this kind and you have it in the ground, you'll find that this is likely to be a shorter period. So you may find it beneficial to grow the bonsai in the ground first, then remove it come late autumn or even the latter part of winter preferably, and then start growing it as a bonsai then, once you have the physical development of the tree in question. Depending on the cultivar in question though, you'll find that the fruit should appear in autumn. Now for how you could grow your apple tree from seed, but be aware this is much slower and we don't advise it unless you have a lot of time to dedicate to this particular endeavor. To do so, you'll need, well, apple seeds rather obviously. You can either choose to collect them from apples you've eaten directly, or from different varieties you've bought for the purposes of getting the seeds. You can, if you don't wish to do so, simply buy them online or at a dedicated store. The seeds themselves are generally very small, hard and annoying. Depending on what you want to do, if you're going to grow multiple varieties, we do recommend separating them out into different containers for each. Lay these out in paper towel and allow them to dry, and then place them in a small shallow container with a little bit of water. Allow the paper towel to soak up the water, and then you put them in a plastic bag in your fridge. You keep them in the fridge for about 2 months, even longer if you can, assuming that you're intending to try and grow them right away. Well, right away in terms of 2.5 months later, but that's one way to do it. The other option is to plant them in the ground and wait until winter comes and goes, and you'd have basically the same effect. This is a method called stratification, and it's necessary for the seeds to be willing to germinate. If you don't do this, it won't happen. And now you can plant them directly into the ground. This will eventually lead to an apple tree developing, but as mentioned, you're growing from seed, it takes a very long time. If instead you have the opportunity, you may wish to take an air layer of a much more developed tree, such as this. It will allow you to create a much better trunk right away and a possibly better branch structure. To take the cutting from an existing tree, you need to find the branch you wish to use as the trunk. We would suggest finding a number of examples as, well, to be blunt about it, air layering is not 100% successful, it just tends to have a higher success rate. You want a branch about 10 to 15 centimeters long, although longer can be used, and it's generally advisable to choose a branch that is not necessarily much thicker than your thumb. If you're going to do that, we do suggest a variety of other ways to do so. Make sure that everything is clean so that you don't get the pathogens that might be on your tools introduced to the wounds you're about to make. Cut a ring around the bottom of where your trunk will be. Then cut a second such ring where you want the soil level to be. This is going to normally be about 5 centimeters or 2 inches, give or take. And then you want to remove all of the bark that is around this ring. Then cut right through at the bottom of the cambium in this exposed section. This should give you about 5 centimeters or 2 inches of cambium that can start developing roots. You're likely to see that the roots will grow at the very top of this, not in the middle or at the bottom. But giving it that amount of space is in our experience, a better option, as it ensures you have a higher success rate. You may wish to apply a rooting hormone or cutting hormone to this area of exposed cambium as well. Pack sphagnum moss or peat moss around this open wound, and then wrap it with something that will keep it protected. We advise something like a plastic bag. This will ensure moisture stays within the area that you're trying to grow the roots and give the roots a reason to grow into the peat moss or similar. After a relatively short period, you should be able to feel, if not see, some roots growing in it. Once you see this, you can cut it off below the level of where you've cut into the cambium, and then transplant this into a pot with soil after you remove the plastic around it. You now want to wait, generally speaking, about a year, in order to ensure the roots and the entirety of the cutting is going to become, let's say, established. Once this happens and you have it securely in a pot where it is growing quite happily, likely not a bonsai pot yet, you can then put this into a full, if not partial, sunlight environment where it will grow and you can start treating it as a bonsai. Another option if you don't want to use an air layer is, well, simply a cutting. This is done somewhat more directly and is arguably more simple. All you need to do is take your apple tree, cut off an appropriate branch that again is relatively thin, no more than one of your fingers likely, remove everything but the very topmost leaves, place the bottom of it after you've removed some of the bark. Depending on who you listen to, you may find that cutting it diagonally is better, but you want to try and ensure that there is at least one leaf bud or budding point buried under the soil. This is partly to encourage root growth from there if possible. And now you ensure you plant it in soil in an appropriate pot and you wait. You should know within a week or two whether or not you've been successful. To be blunt, once it starts dying, you know it's failed. If it remains alive after this time frame, we recommend leaving it be or not doing anything for a year. Partly to encourage growth and allow it to settle into its pot, but also, to be quite blunt, to ensure you don't inadvertently kill it. Other than how you get the tree to start, from what we've described, there are very few differences from the very beginning example. Arguably, there aren't really any at all in how you will train and style your apple tree bonsai. The only real difference is whether or not you want to get a head start in things like the trunk girth, branch structure, or if you want to have complete and utter control over your bonsai tree from the very start using a seed. Hopefully with this you can now see how to create, style and grow your own apple tree bonsai. While you may not get fruit in the first year or two, it is possible to have fruit in that time, especially if we're talking about, say, cuttings or air layers. It is more likely, however, you will start to get a full display of flowers followed by fruit within 4 to 5 years. Of course, it assumes you can keep your bonsai tree alive that long in good health and give it the necessary requirements for that to happen. If that is the case, you should have quite a stunning display of flowers followed by fruit in reasonably short order. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions or suggestions you have below.